Okay, welcome back. Happy New Year. Let's pick up with a few things. Firstly, looking at the State of CSS 2021 results, which came out fairly recently. I had a few thoughts on these. Firstly, just an interesting thing is the actual scale of numbers. You never actually know how many people fill out the survey. This time there was a percentage breakdown, but also the specific numbers. So you could see how many people are actually responding to this thing, and that gives you a little bit more insight into the kind of meaning behind those results. The numbers are actually quite small. So I think it was kind of mostly US, a bit of UK, but then some countries like ones and twos. It's actually quite like a small hobby group of a few thousand people responding to this survey. And obviously those are the people that are most interested in CSS, the people who are willing to give a few minutes to sit and fill out a survey about what things they're using and what they do. That's kind of ignoring that kind of big under the iceberg kind of factor, like how many people are forced to use CSS but they kind of just work around it, or how many people kind of defer to some JS solution because they kind of don't want to have to deal with it, or a tailwind because they want to be able to just pull something off the shelf. How many people use some sort of framework, or how many people, even that if CSS is your interest, it's something that you came into a company, it was already set up, you didn't innovate it, you didn't change it. So when you're filling out questions about what tools you use, what build tools, what frameworks, what libraries, you're really just talking about what you happen to be using day to day. It's not really suggesting a preference or an interest. There's also that thing, if you're not interested, you're still the majority of people. So there are questions like, do you enjoy using CSS, or is CSS moving too fast? But you're asking the people who inherently have already filled out a survey to suggest they're interested in CSS. So those numbers are always kind of a bit dodgy to draw too much conclusion from. There's also this kind of tribal thing. You get it in all development, from like tabs versus spaces to kind of different JS frameworks and so on. So CSS is starting to have it with the tailwind utility thing, that you have to be very strictly for or against, rather than just seeing it as an option or a solution. People kind of very quickly adopt something, usually the first thing they learn or the first thing they encounter, and then brutally defend it. They're like, this is the one and everything else is wrong for some reason. And I guess that kind of starts to happen with these results, where I think people skew to sort of go like, yes, I'm all for this, or yes, I'm against this, versus just showing you, here's a selection of options out there. I kind of think that with new CSS features, there's a lot of questions about, have you used this yet? Have you used this? What's kind of interesting more is to see the breakdown over the years. So you see something like CSS Grid, like a few years ago it was like 50%, now it's getting up towards like 70, 80. It suggests that even though the tech is there and it hasn't really changed much over the years, it has to still go into human heads and be absorbed as an idea. You have to take the time to go and just read it. And also you have to run into a problem, like a grid system. How frequently are you rebuilding the entire, layout structure of websites? So it might be that over time people eventually went, this might be a chance to learn that new thing. It's worth noting that for everyone's talking about this year being like container queries, the polyfills are coming in, everyone's going to start adopting container queries. Well, it's a whole new convention, there's a whole new syntax, there's a whole new bunch of things. So people that are really keen will, but in terms of it just being a standard, it's going to take a few years to seep through into people's projects, into people's minds. Something like multi-column, you see, it's kind of not incremented much over the years, as if the people who adopted it did straight away, but other people just haven't yet found a use for it, and that's kind of indicative. I think you kind of see some features will get only a certain level of adoption and never much further. Those charts which show like what's the most popular, what's number one, what's number two, or what's the most adopted, what's these things, firstly the numbers seem kind of not particularly useful, but also, let's say, the group that are filling it out are kind of hobbyist types in the first place. It doesn't always suggest this is the one that everyone's using, so much as this is the one that a lot of people happen to have chosen this time around. And those kind of numbers could easily dip 1 and 2. But really it's kind of interesting just to get a snapshot. I think that's kind of what these tools are best for. Not about who's picking what's number one and what's fallen to number two, but like, give me a summary of what are the 10 tools that people use out of the box. This is how you can start to spot trends over time. You can see what things fall and what things rise over periods of time. And I think that was the most useful thing for me. I can see CSS features that I've never really encountered or never found a use for. You can jot those down as little learning points, or things like what tutorial sites, what podcasts, what things are people listening to, what people are reading. And the State of JS is the same thing. It gives you little prompts about areas you might want to dig into further to just broaden your horizons, if that's something you're into doing. Anyway, there's plenty to get on with in 2022. So here's a good one you can do. We've got this div here, standard inline block, so it just fills the available space. By default, we've got this lorem ipsum and it just kind of pushes into the edge of the screen. And obviously you can set 500 pixels, say, and that will restrict the text down, squish it where it can, and that you can obviously go down and down if you get to like 300, 200. Eventually, if you get smaller than the available text, it pushes out. You get the famous CSS is awesome because it will obey the width above anything else. There is now a intrinsic sizing. There's max content, which is not the same as we had when there was no width setting on this. We will just fall to one line. It's basically going to say the max possible space you can fill. If there's a container that's restricting that width, that's different. Whereas here you're just going to fill that one line instead and just keep pushing to all the available space. Inversely, if we go to min content, it's going to fall back, but only so far as it still contains the content. So it's never going to squish that last word. It's going to operate off what the largest available space once every bit of content fits. Scenarios where the content's dynamic, you're not sure what the minimum width or the maximum width is, these might be quite helpful. One to keep in the back pocket, you know. Okay, cool. So I'm going to have a link now for best websites of 2021, which I'll pop in the description. What's not nice in January is all those articles about predictions and trends and things that are going to be big this year, because basically no one knows. Also, if you want to find a trend of a particular thing, you can find it. The internet's big enough that if you want to see people will use this color or this font or this design trend, you can probably find enough examples. In truth, there's just too much out there to know anything like that. And similar with technology trends, it's hard to know really what's going to really take traction just based on rollout times and specifically who you're talking about. So I don't put too much stock in best sites of 2021. Like, are they the best? It really depends on what type of site and what you're looking. You get usually the best ones on these lists are just things that are visually beautiful, really interesting. And you could argue like, no, a good website is one that's functional and accessible and performant and does its job. And a lot of these are kind of more brochure sites and e-commerce sites and fancy things. But it's just quite nice, little food for thought. There's so many negatives these days that the web is becoming so stock and ubiquitous. Everything kind of starts to look the same and people build the same websites over and over, and these conventions are limiting. So yeah, quite nice just to flick through some of these examples, load them up. Obviously a lot of kind of WebGL, fancy effects, lots of beautiful setups for games and 3D and immersive stuff, but some just pleasant, original layouts, nice imagery, nice colors, and some of these things can be kind of trailblazers for ideas for the future, things we should all focus on learning. So yeah, worth a little click through if you get time. Best websites of 2021 on Web Designer Depot. That's all we got. Thanks.